Hello, everybody. Professor Barth is here, Associate Professor of History at Arizona State University. Welcome to part 2 of The World of Thucydides. War is a violent teacher. Human nature laid bare. That's the topic today. If you haven't seen part 1, you're going to want to do so. Provide some of the context of Thucydides, the man, the great historian of ancient Greece. This is the beginning of a new playlist I've begun on his channel entitled Foundations of Western Political Thought. We begin with Thucydides, the author of the great history of the Peloponnesian War that took place in the 5th century BC between Athens and Sparta. What a war! Epic conflict. Thucydides has a lot to say about it, especially on the subject of human nature, and that's the theme for today. Now, in previous videos, I've said a whole lot about human nature. A few years back, I think 5 or 6 years back, I reviewed a book by Thomas Sowell called A Conflict of Visions. I highly, highly recommend it. And in this book, Thomas Sowell argues that the ideological conflict that we see between left and right can really be traced to a difference in worldview regarding the nature of man. On the one end, you have a worldview that believes that human nature, that human beings are innately good and even perfectible, that the instincts of man at birth or in a so-called state of nature are inherently wholesome. Utopia in this vision is theoretically possible. Nevertheless, this worldview encounters a problem. If man is naturally good, if man is innately good, well, how do we explain evil? There's evil all around us. How do you explain evil? And the answer to that question from this worldview is that evil is cultivated, taught, and learned through the work of institutions, through corrupt, deficient political, social, cultural institutions. And these include everything, not just government, but also traditions, family, religion, the law. And so when society fails to live up to these abstract ideals, fails to live up to utopia, when, for example, there is inequality, and there's inequality in a society, then that means something must be wrong. Not with man, but with the institutions, necessitating, by implication, the radical reform, if not outright overturning, of existing institutions. And in its place, the establishment of new institutions in order to create a new man. And hence the utopian dream. And this idea regarding human nature and the innateness, in the innate goodness of human nature dates back to Rousseau, and we'll do a series on Rousseau later in this course. But also you see it in the French Revolution. You see it in the 20th century with Lenin, and then in Maoist China with the Cultural Revolution. And so this has a wide impact. The alternative view, the opposing view, is that human beings are inherently limited. That man by nature, especially in an uncivilized state, is radically corrupt, vicious, and depraved. That the depravity of man is man's natural innate state. Now, this worldview does not deny that there are virtues in man. This worldview does not say that there is no goodness in man. Rather, the virtuous side of man, the goodness of man, must be cultivated. The default setting for man is not virtue, but vice. So in a computer program or on your phone or on any electronic device, usually you can go into settings and you can select default. What's the default setting? Well, what's the default setting for man? And the default setting for man is this innate barbarism, this depravity, this radical corruption, this viciousness. Traits that are innate to uncultivated man include vanity, envy, strife, deceit, sensuality, lechery, cowardice, stupidity, folly, rashness, debauchery, greed, covetousness, licentiousness, guile, slander, a murderous spirit. All of these are natural to man in a state of nature. Man at birth possesses these innate qualities about him. Christian philosophy calls this sin. Secular philosophy calls this vice. But it's all innate to man. It's all original in man. And so you must cultivate virtue. It's not natural, so you must cultivate it. You must learn it. But how? And the answer to that is through the work of institutions, through what we might call civilizing institutions. And these institutions help to transform man from a state of barbarism to one of civilization. And so the primary role of institutions is to check the innate destructive passions of man, to incentivize goodness and to disincentivize the bad. And again, institutions include everything from government to law to family to education, religion, customs, traditions, etc. And when functioning properly, all of these work to make civilization possible. Utopia is not possible. There's no such thing as utopia. The thing to aspire for is not utopia, but civilization. That's what you want to aspire for, while recognizing that civilization still has imperfections. It still has crime. It still has inequality. That's the reality of man. You can't escape that. It's natural to man. These vicious traits remain natural to man and persist onward even after the civilizing influence. The question is one of degree. And here's the thing, and then we'll move on to Thucydides here. If you eliminate or if you undermine those civilizing institutions, or if you rashly overthrow them, the result is very, very ugly. It results in human nature run amok, and ultimately ends in either tyranny or anarchy, both of which are terrible results. And so civilization in this worldview is very, very fragile. It's like glass. It can easily shatter very, very quickly before you know it. And so Thucydides was deeply interested in human nature and in human behavior. And he was particularly interested in the excesses to which human nature is prone during times of emergency, plague, massacre, war. Thucydides was fascinated by societal breakdown, by the condition of human beings when stability and institutions are stripped away from them like a rug that's, yanked out from underneath you. What happens when the thin veneers of civilization come crashing down? That's what Thucydides is interested in. And he believes that it's in moments of crisis, in moments of instability, when human nature is fully revealed in its most raw, genuine form. What is the natural disposition of man? And Thucydides concludes that fear, that self-interest, are at root the prime drivers of human behavior, and this really comes out during crisis. And the crisis we're going to focus on, and that Thucydides finds particularly fascinating, is a civil war that erupted in Corcyra during the early years of the Peloponnesian War. You had two rival camps. You had the small d Democrats, and the Democrats wanted to side with Athens. Then you had the aristocrats, the oligarchs. They wanted to side with Sparta. Well, long story short, the Democrats received help from the Athenians. The Athenians provided ships. They defeated the oligarchs and then executed the oligarchs, sold their women and children into slavery, and then went on just a rampage and slaughtered anyone whom they suspected of being an enemy, whom they suspected of harboring pro-Spartan, pro-Peloponnesian leanings. And so it was brutal. It was gruesome. And Thucydides gives us some of the details. I want to look at this and analyze what Thucydides has to say. The Corcyrans, he said, went on killing as many of their own people as they took to be their enemies. They accused him of subverting the democracy. But some of the victims were killed on account of private hatred, and some by their debtors for the money they had lent them. And so what we see here is, first of all, sort of a paranoia and accusations being thrown around. So-and-so is an enemy. Go get him. And the hysteria of such an atmosphere. But also we see the pretense of an ideal, striving for an ideal, but the reality that many of the victims were killed on account of private hatred, self-interest. Some by their debtors for the money they had lent them, covetousness. Every form of death was seen at this time. And, as tends to happen in such cases, this is a reality of human nature, there was nothing people would not do and more. So cruel was the course of this civil war. What happens when people are deprived of basic necessities like food and water? Well, what happens? They lose virtue. They lose that goodness that those civilizing institutions had taught them, and they revert back to their innate barbarism. And it's ugly. Civil war brought many hardships to the cities, such as happened and will always happen as long as human nature is the same. So here we have a case study from, according to Thucydides, this is his Exhibit A, but he believes these are transcendent truths, that these remain every bit as relevant in any other period. These aren't subjective realities here. These apply to all human beings. If Thucydides knew that somebody almost 2.5 millennia later would be analyzing this work, he would have assumed that what he's describing here, the basic tenets, his basic thesis, would remain every bit as true in that future society 2.5 millennia later than his own society, than in Corcyra at this moment in 427 BC. Civil war brought many hardships to cities such as happened and will always happen as long as human nature is the same, although they may be more or less violent or take different forms depending on the circumstances in each case. So the particulars might vary, but at bottom, this is how it works. This is human nature laid bare. In peace and prosperity, cities and private individuals alike are better minded because they are not plunged into the necessity of doing anything against their will. The civilizing influence. But war is a violent teacher. It gives most people impulses that are as bad as their situation when it takes away the easy supply of what they need for daily life. And then what does it lead the people to do? Inventing artful means for attack and bizarre forms of revenge. You wouldn't believe what people are capable of doing. The evil, the wickedness, the barbarism. Why? Because it's innate in man, and civilization has been stripped out from underneath him. And so that viciousness, and that word viciousness, by the way, of course, the word vice is in there, comes out in full force. And he continues, they reverse the usual way of using words to evaluate activities. Ill-considered boldness was counted as loyal manliness. Prudent hesitation was held to be cowardice in disguise, and moderation merely the cloak of an unmanly nature. Words lose meaning. Courage becomes cowardice. Stupidity becomes intelligence. Sudden fury was accepted as part of manly valor. In brief, a man was praised if he could commit some evil action before anyone else did. Can you imagine if in America today in 2022, if civilization, if our civilizing institutions, if our prosperity were just pulled out from underneath us? Can you imagine what would happen to American society? Do you want to imagine what would happen to American society? I wouldn't. It would get ugly very, very quickly. And so it did in Corcyra. As for oaths of reconciliation, when there were any, these were offered for the moment when both sides were at an impasse and were enforced only while neither side had hope from abroad. But on the first opportunity, deceit, guile, When one person saw the other unguarded and dared to act, he found his revenge sweeter because he had broken trust than if he had acted openly. So dishonor becomes the norm. There's no trust in such a society. It's civilization that allows for trust between man and man. The cause of all this was the desire to rule out of avarice and ambition. Power, the lust for power, so natural to man. And the zeal for winning that proceeds from those two. Those who led their parties in the cities promoted their policies under decent-sounding names. Equality for ordinary citizens. Oh, what a nice name. Sounds good to me. That was on one side. The other side said, oh, moderate aristocracy. Oh, they're a moderate aristocracy. But that's just the pretense. That's just the pretense. See, though they pretended to serve the public in their speeches, they actually treated it as the prize for their competition. And striving by whatever means to win, both sides ventured on most horrible outrages without any regard for justice or the public good. Each party was limited only by its own appetite at the time and stood ready to satisfy its ambition of the moment, either by voting for an unjust verdict or seizing control by force. Human nature laid bare. Thus was every kind of wickedness afoot throughout all Greece by the occasion of civil wars. Simplicity, which is the chief cause of a generous spirit, was laughed down and disappeared. Citizens were sharply divided into opposing camps. Oh, polarization. No speech was so powerful, no oath so terrible as to overcome this mutual hostility. The people were unable to rely on trust. For the most part, those with the weakest minds had the greater success. Since a sense of their own inferiority and the subtlety of their opponents put them into great fear that they would be overcome in debate or by schemes due to their enemies' intelligence. They therefore, that is, the weakest minds, went immediately to work against them in action, while their more intelligent opponents, scornful and confident that they could foresee any attack, thought they had no need to take by force what might be gotten by wit. They were therefore unprotected and so more easily killed. In times of crisis, when civilization is stripped away, it's the weak, the stupid, the unsavory who triumph. Most of these acted from a passionate desire for their neighbors' possessions. But there were also those who attacked the wealthy not for their own gain, but primarily out of zeal for equality, the utopian schemes. And they were the most carried away by their undisciplined anger to commit savage and pitiless attacks. Oh, the power of a covetous spirit. Now that life had been thrown into confusion in the city, human nature, which is accustomed to violate justice and the laws, came to dominate law altogether. The law, properly understood, transcends human nature. It's independent of human nature. It's institutional. In secular philosophy, they call it natural law. In Christian philosophy, there's also a concept of natural law, but there's also God's law. But neither the natural law or God's law are ruled by human nature. Rather, the law rules over human nature. It checks human nature. Human nature is subjected to the law. But during times such as these, it becomes reversed, and human nature then dominates the law, and things become arbitrary. Just overthrow the law. Let's rewrite the law. Let's overturn the Constitution. It's inconvenient. And so human nature came to dominate law altogether and showed itself with delight, to be the slave of anger, the master of justice, and the enemy of anyone superior. Oh, the weak are so envious of the strong, so envious of the more intelligent, of the prudent. When they want revenge on others, people are determined first to destroy without a trace the laws that commonly govern such matters. Just destroy it. Though it is only because of these, it's only because of the law, it's only because of the legal institutions that were in place that anyone in trouble can hope to be saved. And so that's the irony. They overturn the very thing that can save them. Even though anyone might be in danger someday and stand in need of such laws, but they're too narrow-minded. They're thinking in the short term out of greed, lust, and ambition. Human nature laid bare. War is indeed a violent teacher. And I'm reminded of Paul's epistle to the Romans. To the Romans, in that first chapter, Paul begins by talking about how the wrath of God is revealed in heaven against unrighteousness. That though God plainly revealed himself in nature, man rejected God and worshiped the creature rather than the creator. And then Paul continues, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased, or the King James Version calls it, reprobate mind, to do what ought not to be done. And that word reprobate is an older word. It's a really great word, though. It means depraved, unprincipled, vicious, wicked, a reprobate mind. Being filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness, gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Look at that, inventors of evil. Didn't Thucydides say something about in Corcyra? Inventing artful means of attack, of bizarre forms of revenge. Inventors of evil. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. The King James translates it this way. They take pleasure. They take pleasure in watching those who practice them. Aye. And so there's a lot of overlap here between, the Christian philosophy of original sin and the sort of secular Thucydidean philosophy of human nature. War is a violent teacher, human nature laid bare. Now, human nature, according to Thucydides, is subject to basic passions, to basic desires. And so, in light of that, Thucydides adopts what political scientists have termed political realism, or the German term realpolitik. And realpolitik is the idea that state policy should be primarily or even solely focused on maintaining, on strengthening political, economic, military security, power, and that state policy should not be primarily based on abstract ideals or ethics. Abstract ideals like justice, morality, democracy. That when approaching policy, we should take human beings for how they are in the real world, not for how we would like them to be, but based on how they actually are. Realism, realpolitik. And so some people, as a result, have described Thucydides as a cynic. He would respond and say, I'm not necessarily a cynic per se, I'm just a realist. I myself, I'm not so sure about this. I mean, I understand it, but I do think you need to be informed, and Thucydides would not necessarily disagree. I think policy must be informed by abstract ideals. Abstract ideals form the bedrock of our nation with the Declaration of Independence. Actually, if you look at the founding of this country, the Declaration of Independence puts forward the abstract ideals, and then the Constitution is the realistic, pragmatic, practical document, the rules of the game. And both are necessary. Both are necessary. So Thucydides here isn't saying that there's no such thing as abstract ideals, but that state policy must primarily focus on the real, must be realistic, and not assume that human beings are how they would like them to be. There's also much tension in this conception of human nature and the idea of democracy. Now, Athens was a democracy. It was the first great democracy. It was actually a direct democracy. It was more democratic than our own country. It was the first great democracy in the ancient world. And so Thucydides comes out of this. He's an Athenian. But if you believe in democracy, which means rule by the people, the demos, and yet you also understand that human nature is radically depraved, how do you reconcile those two? How do you give power to a people who are depraved? And so there's a tension here that Thucydides must wrestle with, and that we must wrestle with. The reality in a democracy. Look, Thucydides, he had sort of a love-hate relationship with democracy. Thucydides deeply distrusted democracy. Why? Well, because of his view of human nature. In a democracy, public opinion is very fickle. The people are fickle. And as a result, good men can suffer in a democracy. Take Pericles, for instance, whom we will detail next time in part 3. Pericles, when a plague erupted, the people went from loving Pericles, he was this great ruler of Athens, went from loving Pericles to blaming Pericles, and public opinion flipped really quickly. And a good man who had nothing to do, a circumstance completely beyond his control, was blamed. Thucydides himself, when the city of Amphipolis was lost, Thucydides claimed to have nothing to do with the loss. He was called back to Athens, put on trial. The democracy convicted him and exiled him for 20 years. And so, according to Thucydides, heroes can come to ruin in a democracy because of fickle public opinion, and weak men can be elevated. We'll see why the latter in a moment. But in times of crisis, especially, democracies are susceptible to mob rule, or stated differently, to human nature run amok. If all you need is a majority in a democracy, you just need that 51%. And when times are very unstable, people become a bit hysterical. They can make very poor, be led like sheep into making very poor decisions, and you can have a situation where a democratic majority becomes oppressive, where the 51% oppress the 49%. Democracy is a very curious system, by the way. By what right do the 51% have to dominate the 49%? Let me take it even further. By what right do the 70%, do the 80%, by what right does a majority of 90% have to dominate the 10%? In a pure democracy, they do. They have that right. Is that wise? Is that prudent policy? There's the old metaphor of democracy is like two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. Well, guess who's for dinner? That sheep. The wolves are going to vote to eat the sheep for dinner. The sheep might protest. Wolves will say, hey, it's democracy. Are you against democracy? And so in times of crisis especially, but really in all periods, but especially in times of emergency, democracies can be susceptible to mob rule. Now, despite Thucydides' distrust of democracy, Thucydides said democracy can work. It can be an effective form of government, but for that to happen, it requires strong leadership. Strong leadership. And his classic example is Pericles. Thucydides puts forward Pericles as the ideal leader in a democracy. Pericles liberates Athens, and Athens enters a golden age under Pericles' wise leadership. And Pericles was a Democrat. He was a Democrat through and through. He had a lot of charisma. He led the people. He garnered a majority, a democratic majority, and he shepherded the sheep in an effective way. He was a strong, adept leader. And so Thucydides says democracies can work, but it requires effective, strong leadership. The problem is that the need for strong leadership in democracies It's very dangerous because it can lead to power-hungry individuals with limitless political ambition to step in and through the power of oratory, through their own charisma, enter into a picture as the demagogue. The demagogue, which means the leader of the common people. But the demagogue, and Pericles is Pericles is a democrat, but not a demagogue. The demagogue, instead of careful, reason, deliberation, decorum, instead of that, the demagogue appeals directly to the emotions, whips up hysteria. The demagogue often calls for immediate, often violent action. We must act now, the demagogue says. The demagogue will often exaggerate dangers, exploit common prejudices, scapegoat unpopular groups. Like the Democrats scapegoated the oligarchs at Corcyra. The demagogue. And so democracies are susceptible to demagoguery. And so there's this tension. Now, the founding fathers recognize this tension as well. One of the people will look at it in this course is James Madison in the Federalist Papers. The founding fathers in crafting the Constitution included some democratic elements, but we do not have a full democracy here in the United States, and we all know this. And it's a good thing we don't. We don't want to be a pure democracy because we would open ourselves up to all of these abuses. Rather, the founding fathers very wisely gave us a mixed government, a balanced constitution. We are not a democracy. We are a republic, or maybe a democratic republic with checks and balances. And one of those checks is to check the violent impulses, the abusive tendencies of the democracy. That's one of the checks. Another check also has to do with human nature, and that's a check on the tyrant. Because just as a democracy can become victim to its own human nature, and all of what we just described, if you place all power in one individual, if you have an absolute monarchy, a dictator, that absolute monarch, that dictator also has a base mind, also has a corrupt, depraved character about him, and probably even more so, because what does power do? Power attracts power-hungry individuals, and as I've said before, the last person you want in power is a power-hungry individual. And so it's a problem. So the founding fathers very wisely tried to balance all the different interests and gave us the Constitution. That's our law. The Constitution is actually crafted in such a way that assumes that human nature, that human beings at root have these innate tendencies of all what we just described. And so the Constitution is a brilliant document. And I think if Thucydides was able to look down into a passage of time and look forward and to view the Constitution, he would have been elated by it, because just all over it's carefully crafted to check all of these violent tendencies. And so that's Thucydides on human nature. Next time we're going to take a look at Athens and Sparta, and then we'll dive into the Peloponnesian War and see what Thucydides has to say about this. See you next time. Bye.